The fluorescent lights in my small office buzzed quietly, a persistent hum that seemed louder than usual that night. I sat at my desk, diploma in hand, framed and dust-free, yet I felt no triumph, only silence, only the echo of years of being told I would never be enough. "You'll never get a degree like Luke," my father had said, voice sharp, confident, final. I remembered my mother nodding, eyes soft but proud of him, and Luke, he'd smirked, leaning against the doorway as if my humiliation were part of the decor. My name is Samantha Hayes. I'm 28 years old, a junior graphic designer working long hours at a small urban agency. I live alone in a modest apartment, and I've spent most of my adult life quietly building my own path, step by step, while carrying the weight of constant comparisons. I traced the edges of the certificate with my finger. Graduation should have felt like a victory. Instead, it reminded me how small I had been made to feel for so long. Before I continue my story, tell me this. Would you quietly endure years of being overlooked or fight back in a way no one could predict? I had learned early that silence was safer than confrontation. I'd learned to smile while swallowing bitterness. And yet, beneath that carefully curated calm, something had shifted. A seed I didn't know I was planting had begun to grow. The idea that maybe, just maybe, the world could see me differently. The hum of the office merged with the patter of rain, a rhythm that matched my pulse. I thought of every snide comment, every comparative glance from my parents, every casual dismissal of my dreams. And I thought, they think this is the end? They think I'll accept my place in their story. They're wrong. I leaned back in my chair, eyes on the framed certificate, and allowed myself a quiet, almost imperceptible smile. This was not a story of victory over Luke. It was not about proving him wrong. It was about reclaiming myself, about turning years of belittlement into something solid, inevitable. And the first steps of that reclamation had already begun, long before anyone noticed. Here at Revenge Bible, we explore real psychological stories of betrayal and justice. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss our next emotional reckoning.
Before the world told me I wasn't enough, my life felt ordinary, but full of quiet purpose. I would wake before sunrise in my small apartment, the soft hum of the city below my window blending with the smell of brewing coffee. I had learned early that routine could anchor a fragile sense of self. My mornings were simple: journal in hand, a sketchbook tucked under my arm, and a cup of tea steaming beside me as I plotted the day ahead. I loved my job as a junior graphic designer, not for the prestige, but for the moments when ideas came alive on the screen. Colors, textures, shapes, they were mine to manipulate. I could create something tangible from nothing. A small reminder that I had control over at least one corner of my life. My colleagues didn't notice much, and that was fine. I was used to existing quietly, to letting my work speak while my family's praise remained reserved for my brother, Luke. Luke had always been the golden child. He was charming, confident, academically gifted, a magnet for attention. My parents couldn't hide their pride when he excelled, and I quickly learned my own successes were either invisible or diminished by comparison. If I earned a high grade, it was not bad for you. If I brought home an award, the congratulatory smile carried an undertone. You're still not Luke. I loved him, but I resented the way the world had taught me I'd always be second. Even outside of work, I sought quiet achievements. I volunteered at a small local library, helping teens explore creative projects. I baked for friends and neighbors, documenting recipes and experiments in my journal. these moments, as small as they were, reminded me that I had value, even when the people closest to me seemed blind to it. At home, tension was subtle but persistent. Family dinners became exercises of endurance. My father would quiz Luke about his day at university, nodding with evident pride, while I recounted my own accomplishments in graphic design and received polite acknowledgement, but no excitement. My mother would sigh softly, shaking her head at the messy handwriting in my journal or commenting on my modest ambitions. I learned to nod, smile, and retreat inward. But I had allies, however few. Miss Jensen, my mentor from night classes, had an uncanny ability to see potential where others saw mediocrity. She encouraged me to think beyond what I believed was possible, reminding me that talent wasn't defined by approval. Tom, an old family friend, quietly cheered me on too. He would offer practical advice, connecting me with opportunities he thought I could reach. Their voices were small but significant in a household where mine was often drowned out. Evenings were my sanctuary. I would sit by the window with my sketchbook, soft piano playing in the background, reviewing designs or mapping ideas for personal projects. I kept my journal open, a place to catalog my thoughts, disappointments, and small victories. I wrote about Luke sometimes, not angrily, but analytically. I noted his strengths and mine, trying to understand why my accomplishments felt so invisible. I used to believe silence was safety. I thought that if I didn't complain, if I didn't demand recognition, I could avoid disappointment. Yet, beneath this calm surface, a quiet storm brewed. Every dismissal, every sideways glance, every comment about my supposed limitations planted a seed of resolve. I began to measure not only what I had achieved, but what I could achieve if I wasn't measured against anyone else. The idea of proving myself, not to Luke, not even to my parents, but to myself, slowly crystallized. It wasn't a rage-fueled obsession. It was a patient awareness, a simmering understanding that life could be redirected. I started noticing opportunities I had overlooked, online scholarships, professional workshops, mentorships. I cataloged them in my journal, noting deadlines, application requirements, and strategies. I imagined a future where my accomplishments could not be minimized by comparison, where recognition was earned on merit, not familial preference. Every day it looked ordinary from the outside. A young woman working late in a modest office, baking cupcakes for friends, jotting ideas in her notebook. But inside, I was quietly strategizing my emergence, layer by layer, opportunity by opportunity. Every overlooked compliment, every dismissive comment, every casual humiliation became raw material. I was learning that resilience wasn't about surviving quietly. It was about transforming invisibility into deliberate and inevitable visibility. Looking back, those years were deceptively peaceful. They were the calm before the storm, a period of preparation that felt almost mundane, but it laid the foundation for everything that would come. I hadn't yet experienced the betrayal that would spark the fire, but the groundwork, my journals, my plans, my quiet resolve was already there, waiting to be activated.
It wasn't a dramatic scene, not at first. No doors slammed, no screams, no thunderclap of revelation. The betrayal came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow sliding across the floor, unnoticed until it was too late. I remember the evening clearly. My parents had invited me over for dinner, an ordinary Tuesday in their meticulously organized suburban home. I had been excited to share my recent promotion and the latest designs I'd completed for a client. I had rehearsed my words in my head, confident in my accomplishments, thinking maybe this time they would see me differently. Luke was there, of course, sprawled in his usual spot at the head of the table, charming, effortless, the golden sun. My mother fussed over his plate, cutting his steak just the way he liked it, while I poured my own glass of water and tried to ignore the subtle contrast. Then it happened. My father, glancing at my portfolio laid open on the table, smiled faintly, but the words that followed were like a knife pressed into my chest. "Samantha, this is nice, I guess, but it'll never be the same as what Luke's doing. That degree, his university, it's bigger, better. Maybe you should reconsider your ambitions." I froze. My fork hovered over my plate. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. Surely he didn't mean it the way it sounded, but his eyes were steady, unwavering, and my mother nodded slightly, her lips pursed as though agreeing silently. Luke glanced at me, smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, not cruel, not malicious, but it stung anyway. He had no idea how sharp that moment felt, how years of being diminished compressed into a single sentence. It wasn't just the words, it was the certainty behind them, the calm authority with which they were delivered. My work, my effort, my late nights and sacrifices, they were invisible. And in that instant, I felt a shift inside me, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a burning sense of injustice. I had spent decades trying to earn approval, trying to demonstrate competence, patience, and resilience, and here it was dismissed so casually. I left the dinner early, pretending my stomach hurt, retreating to the car parked in the driveway. Rain had started again, soft and insistent, and I watched the droplets race down the windshield, each one reflecting my own mounting clarity. For years, I had tolerated comparisons, silenced my own ambitions to avoid conflict, and yet the moment my father dismissed my achievements, I realized something essential. I had been underestimated, and that underestimation was my power. The betrayal didn't end with a single dinner. It extended in the following weeks, my parents casually dismissing invitations to my gallery showing, forgetting to congratulate me on a freelance project that had brought new clients, praising Luke's minor accomplishments while mine went unnoticed. Each act, small and deliberate, was another thread weaving a pattern I could no longer ignore. I remember a particular evening when I returned home after a long day at work. Luke had called to boast about his latest academic award. I congratulated him genuinely, but in the background I could hear my mother's voice lightly teasing me. "Well, maybe you'll get there someday, if you really try." The words were soft, almost polite, but they cut deeper than any accusation could. That was the moment I realized the betrayal wasn't just in words or actions, it was structural. My parents, intentionally or not, had framed my entire existence as a lesser version of Luke's. The message was clear. I was never enough, and they never believed I could be. I sat alone that night, journal open, the pages empty except for a single line scrawled in pencil. "They think this is the end. They're wrong." The pen shook in my hand, not with rage, not with despair, but with the first spark of determination. I would no longer exist in the shadow of their favoritism. I would not seek revenge through malice or cruelty. I would reclaim my worth quietly, methodically, and with precision. That night, betrayal became the catalyst. It was no longer about wanting to prove my parents wrong. It was about proving to myself that I had value, independent of their recognition. Every injustice, every overlooked effort, every belittled achievement had built an invisible arsenal inside me, and now I knew exactly how to deploy it. The betrayal was complete, and in that quiet, storm-soaked night, I promised myself one thing. The next chapter of my life would be mine alone, and no one, neither Luke nor my parents, would dictate its measure. The realization didn't hit all at once. It crept in, quiet and deliberate, like sunlight seeping through a crack in a shutter. At first it was small things, an offhand comment, a forgotten email, a pattern that didn't make sense. I noticed the inconsistencies, the subtle favoritism, the carefully measured words that framed Luke as exceptional and me as dispensable. It began with my student records. While reviewing my own transcripts to prepare for a professional certification, I noticed that Luke's achievements were exaggerated in casual conversations, accolades repeated and celebrated without verification. Curious, I requested my own transcripts from night school, certified copies, official documentation. Comparing them, I realized something startling. The difference between our accomplishments was not as wide as they had made me believe. My parents' perception, their constant framing of Luke as superior, had been a narrative crafted over decades, reinforced at every opportunity. Then came the emails from my freelance clients. I had noticed a few missing congratulatory notes from my parents, minor things, a simple acknowledgement, well done. But reviewing my sent invoices and thank you follow-ups, I discovered my father had forwarded some of my completed projects to Luke, embellishing them as though they were his ideas. My chest tightened as I read the messages, each one a reminder that what I had built quietly was being claimed, even unintentionally, by another. I spent nights piecing together the pattern. Every dinner, every holiday gathering, every casual family conversation, it all formed a web. My parents' behavior wasn't accidental. It wasn't ignorance or forgetfulness. It was selective attention, deliberate elevation of Luke, careful minimization of me. And the more I documented it, the clearer the truth became. I had been underestimated, dismissed, and framed as inferior my entire life. Dim interiors and the soft glow of my desk lamp became a companion during this period. I pored over journals, emails, old assignments, and photos, cross-referencing dates and events. Each discovery chipped away at disbelief and replaced it with controlled anger, a measured, cold clarity. I wasn't overwhelmed by emotion. I was guided by it. I understood that revelation without action was meaningless. The truth alone was fuel, not the destination. The subtle turning point came with a voicemail I had saved months ago from Miss Jensen, my mentor. In it, she had encouraged me to submit my portfolio for a national design competition. At the time, I had hesitated, unsure if I was ready. Listening again, in the context of everything I had uncovered, the message felt like a map. External validation existed, but it had been obscured by the narratives in my own home. Recognition could come, my work could be seen, and respected without their approval. I also discovered small moments of betrayal I had ignored. Luke boasting in casual conversation about ideas he had seen on my desk, casual dismissals of my achievements framed as jokes, my parents' reactions calculated to minimize my confidence. Each detail was small, almost laughable if it weren't so corrosive over time. It was the accumulation that mattered, the pattern that revealed intent. By the end of those weeks, the shock had evolved. It was no longer hurt or confusion, it was awareness, a sharp, precise understanding that I had been living under the constraints of someone else's narrative. And in that awareness, I found clarity. My anger was no longer raw or impulsive. It was strategic. It was measured. I could feel it settling into a plan, a methodology that would allow me to reclaim my achievements, my dignity, and my future on my own terms. I documented every detail, every inconsistency, every forwarded email or minimized comment. Each entry in my journal became a piece of the puzzle. I could see the web clearly now, understand its threads, and anticipate the next steps. I realized that revenge, if it was to be meaningful, had to be deliberate, calm, and morally unassailable. It wouldn't be about cruelty or humiliation. It would be about balance and justice.
about reclaiming what was always mine. Sitting at my desk one rainy evening reviewing the collected evidence, I allowed myself a quiet moment of satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of victory yet, but the satisfaction of clarity. I knew the terrain now. I understood the rules, the obstacles, and the tools at my disposal. And most importantly, I realized that the betrayal, while painful, had created an unexpected advantage. Insight. I could act with precision. I could reclaim my worth without steeping to malice. The discovery was complete. The path forward was not yet taken, but it was visible, marked by careful observation, evidence, and understanding. And for the first time in my life, I felt fully in control, not of them, but of me. And that made all the difference.
When discovery gives you clarity, the next impulse is usually one of two things: lash out or design. I chose the latter. Anger is combustible and short-lived. Strategy endures. I had exhausted the impulsive routes. Anger only made me smaller, more predictable. If I was going to change the story, I needed method, allies, and a timeline. My desk lamp became a metronome. Nights were no longer for drifting, they were for construction. I opened a fresh section in my journal and titled it simply, Plan. Underneath, I wrote the first rule: no theatrics, moral clarity only. This was not about shaming them in public or creating a spectacle. It was about building an outcome so unambiguous that anyone looking at the facts would see the truth. I would make my life undeniable. Step 1 was documentation. I created a secure folder, digital and physical, for everything: original design files, timestamps, client emails, invoices, drafts, and social proofs. I scanned old sketchbooks, photographed early drafts, and exported drafts with metadata intact. The habit of keeping meticulous notes, a defining habit I had once thought insignificant, became an invaluable asset. Evidence is not revenge by itself. It's the scaffolding that supports a fair narrative. Step 2 was amplification. If my work had been minimized at home, I needed to place it somewhere where merit mattered more than family lore. Miss Jensen was the first person I called. Her voice over the phone was steady. She had been waiting for me to stop shrinking. She suggested a national design competition and offered to review my submission. Tom connected me with an editor at a small creative journal who'd once praised a piece of mine at a community showcase. Between them, I had critique, credibility, and access. The plan required more than accolades. It needed momentum and legitimacy that couldn't be dismissed as luck. I began by submitting a reworked portfolio, curated to highlight projects that demonstrated impact, not just aesthetics. Each case study included client briefs, measurable outcomes, before and after visuals, and client testimonials. I asked past clients for short written notes about how my design had affected their business. People respond to results. Family narratives rarely survive metrics. Next, I set up a quiet campaign to increase visibility. No dramatic public posts or revenge videos, only professionalism and presence. I updated my LinkedIn with moderate, factual entries about projects and outcomes. I posted to a design forum, sharing process work and inviting thoughtful critique. I entered competitions with strict deadlines and polished submissions. The work itself became my argument. Each recognition, an honorable mention, a feature, a small award, was a data point I recorded in the journal folder, a bead on a string. I also prepared for the interpersonal terrain. Changing the narrative at home required patience. Public proof would not necessarily equal immediate contrition. So I planned for different reactions: denial, dismissal, quiet jealousy, or, best of all, curiosity. For that, I rehearsed conversations, short, calm statements that referenced facts rather than feelings. If my father minimized an award at dinner, I would respond with a gentle fact. The award was judged by a national panel. Here's the publication. Facts disarm defensiveness. Stories provoke it. There was one ethical line I refused to cross: manipulation of evidence. I would not doctor files or set traps. The revenge I sought had to stand up to scrutiny. In that way, it would be transformational rather than destructive. My goal was to reclaim authorship of my own life, not to create a spectacle to humiliate someone else. Financial strategy mattered too. Small victories required resources to compound. I applied for a professional development grant using the documentation I'd collected as proof of impact. Tom introduced me to a microgrant that supported women-led creative startups. I prepared a business outline, projecting conservative revenue, showing measured outcomes from previous freelance projects, and demonstrating a clear plan for growth. The application required references. Miss Jensen and one of my satisfied clients wrote short letters explaining my role and the results. I submitted the application at 3 a.m, hands steady. There was a legal dimension I considered, but only engaged minimally. Consultation, not confrontation. I spoke once with an intellectual property attorney, just a 30-minute session. The attorney confirmed a few practical steps: retain original files with timestamps, add copyright notices to public work, and, where necessary, send polite professional notices when work was misattributed. The attorney's tone was practical, almost mundane. What felt like vindication was in reality preventative care. It wasn't about lawsuits, it was about boundaries. The plan also included soft power, relationships outside the family that would see me as I saw myself. I volunteered to teach a one-off workshop at the community college. It wasn't a declarative move. It was a way to be seen as an authority in small, meaningful circles. The class filled. Afterwards, one student sent an excited email about how a simple layout tip changed her volunteer newsletter. Small echoes like that accumulated into a chorus. Weeks turned into months. Each step was a quiet block stacked on another. When a small design blog featured one of my case studies, I printed it and slid it into my folder. When a client left a glowing testimonial, I scanned it and filed it with the rest. Each piece of evidence felt less like trophies and more like truth reassembled. I began to feel a new identity settling in, not reactionary, but intentional. There were moments of doubt. I would sit at my kitchen table, journal open, and wonder if this slow, precise approach would ever register where loud voices once reigned. But each time I felt the old impulse to shout, I opened the folder and let the facts speak. They were patient allies. I refined scripts for family encounters, short, calm lines that never asked for permission to exist. I was featured in X publication. My studio just won a small seed grant. Stating facts was an act of reclaiming space. It removed the emotional bargaining I had been forced into for years. By the time I closed that journal for the night, the plan felt less like revenge and more like reclamation. I had traded the theater of confrontation for the discipline of proof, the heat of reaction for the coolness of evidence. What I was building was not a trap, but a foundation, one that could not be easily dismissed or framed away. If you're drawn to stories where calm turns to power, stay with us.
Subscribe to Revenge Bible for more tales of justice served quietly.
When all the pieces were gathered, execution depended on timing. I waited for a moment when recognition could arrive not as provocation, but as undeniable evidence. The first move was small. A National Design Award notification on a Tuesday morning. The panel praised the project's measurable impact on a nonprofit's fundraising. I read the email twice to be sure. I printed the announcement and added it to the folder. Client testimonials, the micro-grant letter, an editorial feature, and the professional development grant that funded my studio update. Each document was earned, time-stamped, and resistant to reinterpretation. I chose an approach that avoided spectacle. I invited my parents to a public community arts exhibit where several designers would display work and speak about process. The invitation felt safe to them, public, low-key, and they accepted. The gallery had warm light and quiet conversations. My pieces were displayed with clear captions and case studies. The panels explained brief, constraints, and measurable results. When my segment came, I spoke concisely and factually. I described the brief, the strategy, and the measurable outcomes. A representative from the nonprofit stood and described how donations increased after our materials launched. Her account was plain and specific. There was no room for reinterpretation. Strangers asked questions. They offered compliments. I watched my parents' faces as facts settled in front of them. Recognition accumulated in ways that can no longer be dismissed. A design magazine profiled my studio. A client offered a retainer contract that made steady income possible. The microgrant allowed me to hire a part-time assistant and invest in equipment. Each new credential joined the folder and, more importantly, reinforced my own authority. I spoke at a small design forum, an unglamorous room, but an audience that cared about craft. The questions were practical. I answered with evidence. That talk led to a profile in a modest design magazine, and then a retainer offer from a client who had read it. Small actions built momentum. At the next family dinner, things shifted. My father listened more than he lectured. My mother asked about the nonprofit I'd helped. Luke cracked a joke that landed thinly. They weren't believers, but they began to measure me differently. That change was an opening. There were setbacks, delayed payments, a proposal that fell through. I treated these as data. Analyze, adapt, iterate. The part-time assistant I hired handled logistics while I focused on strategy. When a larger client requested a rebrand, we won the contract. That stability allowed reinvestment in the studio. I didn't aim to humiliate. I invited my parents into my world on my terms. A briefing, an article, an exhibit. When they engaged, I offered clarity rather than confrontation. That restraint kept the moral high ground and made my success an example, not a weapon. A local segment later featured my studio. Neighbors recognized our work and referred clients. People began to introduce me by my title, Samantha Hayes, studio director, which felt like a kind of liberation. The real payoff was internal. The folder that had been a strategy became an archive of growth. I no longer needed their verdicts to be whole. Praise from my parents became a bonus, not currency. I had reclaimed the measure of my life, and that, quietly, was victory. I moved forward with calm confidence, knowing I had finally authored my own story fully.
This past month, the rain that had once streaked my apartment window now fell softly on a morning that felt entirely different. Sunlight, pale and forgiving, filtered into my workspace. My studio was quiet but alive, humming with equipment, computers, and the low chatter of my part-time assistant organizing client briefs. I poured myself a cup of tea, carried it to the window, and watched the city wake. For the first time, I felt the kind of peace that doesn't require validation from anyone but yourself. The journey to this point had been long, deliberate, and quiet. No one witnessed the months I spent meticulously documenting work, curating portfolios, or applying to competitions. No one saw the nights I spent reviewing old journals, tracing every small moment of favoritism and dismissive comment, and transforming them into a roadmap for action. Those hours were mine alone, a labor of self-discovery and reclamation. When my parents finally saw the results, it was without drama. The gallery exhibit, the award notices, the magazine feature, they were facts, impossible to ignore, and utterly devoid of exaggeration. I had resisted the urge to gloat. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself, and in that calm presentation, I reclaimed not only recognition, but the right to define my own worth. Luke, once so untouchable in our family narrative, now viewed me differently. Not out of fear or resentment, but a grudging respect. My parents, similarly, began asking questions they hadn't considered asking before. How did you manage this? What is your next project? And I answered honestly, factually, and with intention. The power in those exchanges wasn't in proving them wrong. It was in proving myself right. Internally, the real transformation was deeper. I no longer equated my value with their attention or approval. I had built something that mattered, something lasting, independent of their perception. That understanding, a kind of quiet liberation, was worth more than any award or feature. It freed me from the constraints of comparison, from the invisible chains that had bound me to someone else's story. The studio became a sanctuary, a space where ideas could flourish without interference. I expanded slowly, taking on projects that challenged me, collaborating with people who respected creativity and process. Each success was layered, measured, and sustainable. And each time I documented it, portfolio, journal, or file, it reminded me how far I had come. There were moments when I revisited old habits, glances at family emails, thoughts of what could have been said, moments of insecurity, but I no longer allowed them to dictate my actions. Reflection became a tool, not a weapon. I processed the betrayal, the comparisons, and the dismissals as lessons. I understood the subtle power dynamics of family, the way favoritism can distort perception, and the resilience required to navigate those dynamics without losing yourself. My relationships outside the family grew stronger. Mentors like Miss Jensen remained steady, offering guidance without judgment. Friends and clients became a network of affirmation rooted in reality rather than conditional praise. I learned to trust in the process, to value feedback from people whose opinions carry substance, not hierarchy. The most profound revelation came quietly. Revenge isn't about retribution. It isn't about humiliation or orchestrated failure for the other party. True revenge is reclamation. It is asserting control over your life in a way that cannot be disputed. My revenge was calm, factual, and inevitable. Not cruel, but precise. By building a foundation that could not be minimized or ignored, I neutralized the power imbalance that had shadowed me for decades. Even my parents seemed to sense the shift.
There was no apology, no dramatic acknowledgement. None was needed. The difference was in their gaze, the subtle recalibration of expectations. They were no longer arbiters of my worth. That authority had shifted entirely to me. And in that quiet, unspoken surrender, I recognized the ultimate justice. My life, fully owned, measured not by comparison, but by competence, creativity, and integrity. I often revisit my old journals. Pages once filled with doubt and resignation now read as the blueprint of transformation. Every small setback, every quiet disappointment, every overlooked effort became a building block. The betrayal that had once cut so deeply had taught me patience, strategy, and self-reliance. I realized, finally, that the story I had been living wasn't my story at all, until I decided it was. I am Samantha Hayes. I'm 28, a studio director, a designer, a creator of measured impact. I am someone who turned humiliation into purpose, comparison into strategy, and neglect into undeniable accomplishment. And in that reclamation, I discovered a peace I had never known, calm, purposeful, and entirely my own. The rain outside has stopped. Sunlight spills across the desk, glinting on awards, letters, and sketches. I sip my tea, journal open beside me, and I allow myself one final thought. They underestimated me for a lifetime, but I underestimated nothing in myself. Here at Revenge Bible, we turn pain into purpose and betrayal into balance. Subscribe and join us for the next transformation.